Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much again for having us to present our different views on the evolving economics of renewable energy for operators of mines. And thank you. My name is Sophie Liu. I'm from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, or Bloomberg NEF. I think many of you are probably already familiar with us already, including the shout out that we got a little bit earlier on the panel. But we're a research and consulting division of Bloomberg, focused primarily on driving value from the movement towards sustainability across many, many different sectors. These are all the various sectors that we cover. Earlier on the panel, I think one of the key challenges that many of the presenters brought up was how do we break down silos between the different sectors and different operating teams within our own companies to be able to communicate the overall value, the sustainability and renewable energy they play across our company. And actually the way that we cover the metals industry at Bloomberg NEF is to help you bridge that gap. So of course, my team covers the metal sector, and we do it from the traditional approach of, covering the assets and covering the performance and operations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, we have many different teams that we collaborate with across our organization to be able to present you information from different angles that hopefully you can utilize to communicate across your different teams. So for instance, we have teams that are dedicated to forecasting the long-term growth of demand drivers in renewable energy, in batteries and electric vehicles, and how that may impact the way that demand will grow for the product, for your product. Additionally, we have teams that are dedicated to looking at the long-term costs of inputs and how they're utilized across your supply chain. So carbon both as an output and as an input, and how it can be utilized, chemicals, and also heat, and how we can decarbonize heat across our supply chain. Finally, we have teams that look at essentially different trends and technologies that are developing in operational efficiency, how you can be utilizing autonomous vehicles across your supply chain, how those costs will evolve, and different case studies of performance across that, and how people are, essentially, different companies are deriving value from implementing those technologies. And then finally, and most importantly, any long-term view that we take on the cost and price forecasts for your different metals products. In the longer timeline of really the post-2025 development, we always take into account competitive dynamics from advanced materials, composites and other, and recycling, and how this may be impacting the long-term growth of your market. So, with no further ado, we'll go a little bit more into some of the updates that we've had from our H1 2019 LCOEs and how this is impacting costs, with the primary focus on Australia being as the main stakeholders in this room today might be interested in this market. Many of you probably have already seen this already, but this is our updated technology cost curves for key renewable energy technologies. So of course, we still maintain that there is going to be almost a 28% learning rate in solar PV module prices, 11% learning rate on onshore wind turbine prices, and an 18% learning rate on lithium-ion battery prices. All of these, as you know, our methodology, the way that we develop them, is that they are technology costs that are reported by hundreds of different participants in the market, manufacturers, and we update them on an annual, biannual basis, excuse me. For every doubling of capacity, learning rate is basically defined for every doubling of capacity. One thing that it may be of interest for some of us to take note is that there has been a bit of a slowdown in the cost declines that we've been seeing in solar PV modules as well as onshore wind. A lot of this is related to the fact that the global market has already reached such a large installed base that it's getting harder and harder to double capacity and thereby reducing costs. There was also a little bit of a slowdown in the China market, as I think many of us, particularly in the solar industry, were aware in around 2017, 2018. We've seen a pickup in terms of overall solar installations and cost decreases in China in 2019, despite the trade war. The solar industry, as well as the wind industry, is being used as one of the valves of financial and economic support to keep the country's economy going despite maybe the negative impacts of the trade wars playing out. So there are various policies that are being implemented, particularly at the local level, that is still driving solar installations. So we are actually forecasting a maintenance of a relatively high amount of installs in 2019 of around 40 gigawatts of utility scale solar. Lithium-ion battery prices, however, continue to decrease significantly. Although about a year and a half or maybe a year ago, there were some concerns around the limitations that material prices may have on the ability of the battery pack prices to continue to decrease, we've seen that there was a small amount of impact in H2 2018, but in H1 2019, lithium battery pack prices have returned to their original rate, and the impact of material prices have been minimized. Particularly looking at Australia, the intercompetitive dynamics between renewable energy and that of conventional energy is shifting quite rapidly. And it's not just driven by the fact that the cost of renewable energy are decreasing so quickly. It's also related to the fact that various factors that are transitioning in the overall energy market in Australia is changing the costs of conventional energy. So for instance, for coal generation, we've noticed that over the last two years, basically between 2016 and 2018, the average cost of black coal generators in Australia in terms of the price that they're offering to the market, so not necessarily their cost of operation, but their price that they're operating to the market has increased. This has been related to several different factors, and it varies, of course, from generator to generator and region to region, but some of it has to do with the fact that other coal plants closing are causing them to have sort of initial capacity cost increases, or many generators are now moving off of long-term subsidized procurement of coal and are becoming increasingly exposed to the volatility in seaborne coal prices. As Australia becomes ever increasingly a larger exporter of energy, it becomes more interconnected with the global dynamics of supply chain volatility, and thereby the price volatility is also imported into your own power system. Besides coal, we see the same development in gas, and I think in Western Australia, you guys actually experienced this even more before that of Eastern Australia. But basically, there's increasing convergence between that of the global LNG netback and that of natural gas prices in Australia. And I'm sure this is probably impacting some of your operations' long-term goals about switching away from diesel. There were some discussions originally of perhaps there would be feasibility in consuming more gas, especially since Western Australia and Australia itself produces so much of its own gas. But we do sort of see this trend facing limitations because of your increasing exposure to, again, international trade volatility and energy. So this is our most recently updated comparison of the essentially solar and wind LCOEs. This is essentially the cost of building a new utility-scale solar or a new onshore wind against the short-term operating costs of thermal generators in Australia. So this is not the cost of building a new coal generator. So we already are at the point now where it's becoming, I think in the next couple of years, it will be even cheaper for you to consider building new solar or new wind, or not you per se, but your utility providers. It may become cheaper for them to consider building new solar and new wind rather than to continue operating on a marginal cost basis their existing coal assets. This is our updated LCOE stack, levelized cost of electricity stack of different technologies for the Australia market, a national average, so it's not regional specific. In terms of so earlier we already saw that there was pretty significant decreases to the cost of wind and solar. But one thing I wanted to particularly highlight is, and this is a common protest, I guess, against adoption of renewable energy in our supply chain, is their variability, right? And so there's been a lot of interest in terms of integrating large-scale batteries, particularly lithium-ion batteries, along with solar and wind generation to make them essentially competitive at a base load basis. And so this is essentially the cost forecast that we have. The variability that you see between the high end of the range and the low end of the range of PV plus battery and wind plus battery really has to do with the way that you're deploying the battery into your system. If you're expecting it to be able to dispatch at a 4-hour load versus that of a 1 to 2 hour load. So that creates a lot of variability in the way that this system could cost you on a base load basis. But basically across the board, and this is for H1 2019, we already see that compared to that operating cost of CCGT and coal, we are already seeing some projects where the PV and wind plus battery combo has become competitive. So it will be very interesting to see how this dynamic now will be evolving in the way that you will be considering deployment of renewable energy in your systems. Just a quick summary of some of the renewable energy projects that we've seen around the world, and in terms of the amount of technology that's been deployed. Before, overwhelmingly, the focus had been on solar. We do see increasing interest in the installation of wind as well in the overall sort of project mix of different renewable energy projects deployed at mine sites. And then in terms of the different kinds of procurement strategies that different mine operators are taking, it's kind of interesting. Essentially, you do see there is definitely a move towards offsetting the risk a little bit by through direct PPAs, as was mentioned earlier on the panel. And then in the minority is when the miners are directly involved in the development project as an IPP or hosting an IPP or even embedding the generation into their overall facilities. And then I think many of you are already in the room, but various solutions providers for the off-grid solutions for miners. I know that yesterday at the conference you had a full dedicated day to looking at essentially the hydrogen economy and what this could mean for both the cost of mine operations as well as future opportunities for your sector. Bloomberg and EAP has a dedicated working team that's looking at this, that's actually based out here in Australia. And they've been looking over the last year at the various sort of challenges and opportunities to support us to be able to develop our own sort of in-house view on the economics of the potential future for hydrogen economy. If any of you have seen our new EVO, the Electric Vehicle Outlook, which we published last month, we incorporated the potential cost implications of fuel cell vehicles into our forecasts. While we don't see a significant deployment of fuel cell vehicles at the passenger EV level, we do see some future potential, particularly after 2030, for the deployment of fuel cell vehicles in heavy-duty commercial vehicles. And this is really going to be the type of trucks and vehicles that you may actually be considering utilizing in your own supply chain. I think we are forecasting by 2040 something along the lines of 5% of new vehicle sales and heavy commercial duty vehicles will be that of fuel cell vehicles. Now that we talked a little bit about the opportunity, I wanted to go through some of the key challenges that we still see remaining in terms of the effective deployment of hydrogen economy. One of the major sort of challenges, and I think this doesn't need to be repeated, is basically that hydrogen in terms of its production is still not very efficient. So you lose 2/3 of the energy that you input in order to produce the hydrogen fuel itself. Much of it comes from both the electrolysis part as well as the fuel cell part. And then because you lose so much of energy in your conversion, you also do, obviously, it's very expensive to produce hydrogen. So we're estimating that if you're producing hydrogen from renewable electricity costs, based off of our own forecast of electricity costs for renewables, we're looking at $32 to $41 per gigajoule of hydrogen fuel. If you produce that from fossil fuels, which maybe perhaps defeats the purpose of converting to hydrogen, we're looking at $15 to $20 per gigajoule. And then finally, at natural gas, where actually it's one of the much cheaper options. In terms of, but however, this is not only a negative story. The cost we do expect to decrease over time. A lot of it is related to both the cost of the decrease in cost of electricity, as well as improvements in capacity factor, efficiency, production, and other natural sort of synergies that you get from scaling up in the industry. So we do see the cost of essentially producing hydrogen from the electrolyzer to decrease to $15 per gigajoule by 2025. I think this is assuming renewable energy costs. Another challenge, key challenge of the hydrogen economy, is that it is extremely difficult to transport. It's extremely difficult, it's extremely unsafe, and there's a lot of sort of limitations as to whether or not we can be piping it around the same way that we normally think of the natural gas supply chain. And then finally, it's expensive to deliver. So Australia obviously is at a very sort of cost competitive level in terms of producing hydrogen in your local economy. However, if you ever wish to be a major exporter of hydrogen, the cost of simply moving around that fuel is something that you're going to have to take into consideration if you ever want to perhaps be supplying Japan. Another major thing to remember is that China, with its scale and its large access to cheap electricity, is also extremely competitive in producing hydrogen. And already there's significant interest, investor interest and technology interest in becoming a major supplier of hydrogen in the Chinese economy. Challenge 4, so scaling it up. One of the things that I think we just cannot forget is how much electricity is actually going to take to produce the amount of hydrogen that, for instance, the Hydrogen Council believes that we're going to need by 2050. So 29,250 terawatt hours. This is more electricity than our current global generation. So we would have to double our power generation, more than double our power generation, just to be able to produce this small amount of hydrogen fuel. So there's still a lot of challenges ahead. And then finally, of course, it will require a significant amount of investment and an unknown amount of subsidies that may be needed to push the hydrogen fuel economy forward. Of course, this is still very forward-looking. We're really talking about 20 years from now. Lots of things can change from between now and then, but these are sort of key lessons maybe to take away as you consider how much investment your companies should be making in this. Okay. I just wanted to end today on a little discussion about, because I know this is a particularly important topic for Western Australia, which is a desire to move a little bit further up the value chain in terms of production of resources. So Australia has always been an exporter of raw resources, but I know that recently there's been a lot of discussion of Lithium Valley and lots of other interests in perhaps consolidating a little bit more of the value add supply chain into the Australian economy domestically. And then not just Australia, but of course stakeholders in Europe, particularly those surrounding the development of the Northvolt project in Sweden, there is also an increasing interest in perhaps moving a little bit more of the battery supply chain and other renewable energy supply chain into your local economy. The Northvolt chart, I think, needs a little bit of updating since VW and Goldman Sachs both just announced that they'll be interested in investing in that project as well. Now, is it possible? So what is the concentration of the overall battery supply chain right now globally? So if you look at the raw resource, these charts are not representative of where the raw resource is being produced. Instead, it's representative of where the raw resource is being refined. Because at the end of the day, that's really a sort of doubling or tripling of the value of the product. So you may be exporting the raw resource, but at the end of the day, much more of the value chain is being captured in the refining sector. And at the end of, and if you look at it, overwhelmingly, over half of the refining for most of the key critical minerals that go into the battery supply chain, as well as other forms of renewable energy, are still concentrated in China and Asia. And well, primarily China, really. And a lot of that has to do with energy costs, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So the next step up from the precursor for battery materials is the component manufacturing component. And if you look at essentially all of the announcements of new component manufacturing capacity by different countries, at the end of the day, China, Korea, and Japan still dominate in terms of the overall supply chain. This is components for lithium-ion batteries. But the same picture plays out in other forms of renewable energy as well. And then finally, the battery cell manufacturing, the battery pack assembly. If you look at it, again, overwhelmingly over half of the capacity is still located in China. It's not just Chinese companies investing into these, of course, it's international companies that are also planning refining component and cell manufacturing capacity in China. Now why? Why is China still so concentrated? And I think this is the reason why today is particularly important for us to consider, which is that at the end of the day, electricity still accounts for over half of the operating costs of most of these facilities, from the precursor all the way to the cell and pack manufacturing stage. And if you look at the sort of cost of battery pack production, and you compare those in Asia versus that of other places in the US or Europe or here in Australia, the competitive dynamics definitely still lean towards the fact that they just have access to much cheaper energy. And if you look at the announcements of potential battery material or battery component or battery pack manufacturing facilities in Europe, they're increasingly focused in areas like Poland, Sweden, and Finland, where again, they have access to cheaper electricity and therefore may actually be competitive with their Chinese counterparts. Now, if we take this picture and we look at Australia, which is the green line here, this is a annual average, I think, weighted towards volume of the industrial power price, realized industrial power price for large industrial customers in Western Australia. It is much higher than all of the other sort of potential markets that might be competing with you in the supply chain. And I think that as Western Australia considers trying to move further up the value chain, that this is one of the key components that they really need to look at. And you as producers, I know that most of us right now are miners, but if any of you are interested in moving a little bit further up that value chain, this is, of course, the energy cost is something that you really need to take into consideration as you're planning for those developments. There are some factors that can come into play besides electricity costs. The way that the cost of production can be reduced for various facilities can be related to government subsidies. So, for instance, in Nevada with the Tesla plant, the Gigafactory, after the $1.3 billion tax break that was granted by the local government, it was able to cut its cost of operations by 25%, putting it at $110 per gigawatt hour, which makes it, kilowatt hour, which makes it competitive with many of its Asia competitors. Another major factor to consider as well is that in China and in some other places in Asia, but primarily in China, when you're looking at their integration across the supply chain, they have a lot of synergies where they're able to derive additional value even from the waste products of refining lithium or refining cobalt, et cetera, et cetera. So, for instance, one of the examples that I found out recently is that China, one of the reasons why they're so good at processing lithium spodumene into hydroxide in country is because the slag and the waste that they produce afterwards, they're able to sell it to local cement producers, and it's actually integrated into their overall value chain. And unfortunately, we don't see that sort of highly integrated raw material supply chain that we see in Australia. So these are some key lessons to take away for your consideration for the next 2 days. Thank you so much for your time. We don't have time for questions today, but if you have any questions afterwards, I'm happy to answer you. Yeah.